Hello and welcome to a DevRel roundtable on a subject that I think most of us will have at least touched on at some point in our DevRel careers, and that is the relationship between developer relations, sales, and marketing. Now, we've got a great group of people to talk about this particular topic. Before we get into the full episode, I want to bring in my co-host, Josh Gross, who is head of growth at Common Room. Hi, Josh.
Hey, Matthew. Great to see you.
And you. So thanks, obviously, go to Common Room for sponsoring DevRel Roundtable. I'd love to hear from you, a bit about what you're doing at Common Room and why this particular topic is of interest to you.
Yeah, definitely. I think what's most interesting about this for me is I had the realization of the value of developer relations multiple times in my career where I worked with our open source groups when I was at Dell EMC to help us to carry a story that not only could teach and provide value to our customers, but also connect some of our proprietary products back to overall outcomes for companies that had open source leanings. Then most recently, I was at Splunk and we were working on open telemetry, a really large open source project for collecting metrics. And what I found there was we could carry the most influence when we were engaging directly with developers through knowledge transfer, education. And so as I saw companies and individuals start to gravitate, it became clear that that was going to eventually lead to product activation, potentially even buying, and social amplification, all of those things. And so here at Common Room, what I focused on predominantly is working with organizations that are open source, open core, because of just the natural fit of community, developer relations, and the relationship it has with overall business outcomes.
Great, thanks. Well, talking of business outcomes, let's bring in our guests to ask them how DevRel and the relationship between sales and marketing affects their business outcomes as well as everything else about their work. So I guess let's bring in Laurent Dogan.
Hello. My name is Laurent, and I'm Director of Developer Relations at Couchbase.
Hello, Laurent. Do you want to give an introduction about yourself as well as where developer relations falls under Couchbase and kind of what some of your goals or KPIs are for your organization?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Laurent Dogan, I can make it painfully obvious that I am French. I live in Paris, in France. I'm the Director of Developer Relations, so everything developer relation at Couchbase. It's a bit of a mix. We report to marketing. We have a community team that reports to marketing. We have a DA team that reports to engineering. Now, my team, DevRel, is really focused on outreach. My job is to give more work to the community team, basically. Increase our community funnel, increase the size of our community so that they get more stuff to do. So that's more outreach. And the way we try to measure things, couple of things. Most of the metrics we do, on my role, is to increase other people's metrics, in the sense that we support community team, we support every other department in the company to become more developer friendly. So that goes with field marketing, that goes with a community team, that goes with SDRs, making our SDR more developer friendly, making them more able to close calls, close deals. We work with field engineering. We enable field engineering to be more developer friendly, so deliver more developer friendly or developer-focused content. So we're sort of tracking all of the developer-focused effort that these teams do. We're still trying to figure out exactly what we're going to use right now. DevRel has been rebooted very recently at Couchbase. I'd love to set up a peer review process for that, because in my feeling is that if your role is to help everybody else, then your best metrics is what they think of what you do. So I'd love to implement some peer review at Couchbase. This is still ongoing. And if not, then we'll go with the classic, let's measure input and let's see if we can tie all the input works that we do into some output using some products like Common Room or others.
Great. Well, let's dive into some of the detail of that in the episode proper. I'm going to bring in Matty Stratton, who is Director of Developer Relations at Ivan. Hi, Matt.
Hey, Matthew. How's it going?
Yeah, very good. Thanks. Good to have you on the round table. So I'm going to ask you the same question that Josh asked Laurent. Where in Ivan does DevRel fall, and what are the core goals for your team?
Yeah, so our developer relations team sits in marketing. We report to the same VP as our community team and our PLG team, which I think is really interesting, and actually learned a lot about the synergy of that at DevRelCon in Prague. So that was really, really cool. We can talk about that some more. But where we focus and kind of think about our metrics and our goals, DevRel can encompass a lot. And so, of course, on one hand, it's all of it, right? But our focus is primarily around awareness and enablement. So our metrics are, we still have a fair number that we're working on that are more output than outcome, and we're working on it. We're a pretty content heavy team. So we're doing a lot around how we're driving long form, very technical enablement content to be able to help developers be successful with all the various open source projects that encompass what Ivan is. But we also do set metrics around, and measurements, at least at this point, around activations and service enablement. And for us, creating new trials is interesting. But for us, we also, because we look at the developer journey, seeing people do things with that. And it's an important thing, because a lot of times we set measurements, and we'll talk about this more later, but I like kind of what I call my internal measurements, or my measures, but not a goal, right? So we can sit there and say, we want to understand this, but you got to be careful, because you'll start setting a goal that has to go up the ziggurat all the time. And we're like, some measurements is okay if they dip and they go up, because we want to see, did we do a thing? So we're trying to do with some of those is see the effect that we have. And then also, we got a lot of plans for measurement that directly connect to how we see our impact to sales and marketing, which happy to talk about a little bit later.
Let's bring in Tim Hughes from Temporal.
Tim, you're the head of sales at Temporal, and I feel like you are the canary in the coal mine in terms of seeing a symbiotic relationship between sales and DevRel. Where does DevRel fall within your org, and are there goals or KPIs that they have to support sales and marketing?
So today, DevRel for us falls inside of the product organization on the open source side, which I think makes a lot of sense in terms of where we are as a company and a project. Temporal and its predecessor Cadence is around 7 years old or so now. But our core kind of goals or things we think about as a company right now is how do we grow the project and how do we grow it as fast as we can with a high quality around it. And from a sales perspective, we really look to the community as the key place that we find the organizations who are ready to engage with us and start a sales process, or at least start up the process of understanding how our commercial offerings can help their journey of adopting Temporal to drive their mission critical workloads, certainly over time. And so the relationship there is like pretty obvious and pretty tight. The sales organization has direct correlation between our performance and the size of the community, but also the quality of the community. And by quality, I really mean how many people are adopting the project, so finding it, learning about it, identifying where and how we can actually assist in developing software inside their organizations. And then certainly as they go through that journey, understand where it makes sense to raise your hand and start engaging with sales and how we can help out. So for all of those things, I think it makes a lot of sense for DevRel today to sit inside the product org where they can help have a bigger impact on how do people find, to use, and adopt our open source project, which eventually leads to our paying customers.
And Dana Oshiro, you are general partner at Heavy Bit Industries, which amongst other things is a fund that invests in developer tool companies. So for your portfolio companies, what role do you want DevRel to play?
I think, so first off, HeavyBit invests directly in very early stage companies. So it's pre-seed through to Series A, which is maybe something to note, because as far as teams are concerned, there's not really a clear delineation between departments, to be honest. I think DevRel plays a pretty generalist role, and in some cases that person has been everything from product marketing and helping take a product, basically doing a lot of like persona-based feature testing and discovery pre-GA. They have done, there's always like the awareness and early usage kind of metrics. They're building social proof and hero making and finding like user generated case study type of content. And then, of course, docs, developer experience design, onboarding, simple APIs. So it's a pretty generalist, like sort of kitchen sink role. And in the same way, the way that they're interacting with, marketing or sales, it's usually one or two people. If sales does exist, to be quite frank.
Great, thank you. So I wondered, do the different strategic reasons or strategic goals that companies have for DevRel impact how they relate to sales and marketing? And I think for you, Laurent, is particularly interesting because am I right in saying that your team at Couchbase falls under marketing, gets at least some of its funding from sales, and yet what you're doing is developer relations? So you're kind of right in the middle of it all.
So the way it started out at Couchbase, we've been going through hoops and loops with the DevRel at Couchbase. Couchbase is a 10 years old company, and COVID happens. The DA team couldn't move out too much. The DA team has been reassigned to developer experience. They're building more developer integration, and now there's an issue that we don't have anyone that's front facing, community facing, outreach facing, and that feedback came from the field, from the SEs, from the sales, and the sales realized they're selling a very technical product. Couchbase is a database company. Sales cycles are pretty long. You need to be very thorough in the way you sell that product. It's not I was going to say it's not an easy SaaS, but that's kind of saying SaaS is hard as well. And so the solution engineer said, we are meeting more and more developers, which is great because marketing started targeting more developers. Couchbase was a on-prem, long sales cycle, moving to a database as a service, more SaaS-like project, less critical, less high performance, less scalability use case, more data use case for everybody. If it's for everybody, you meet every developer. If you meet every developer, you need to have your speech more developer friendly and less. This is how you scale a massive cluster and talk about metric and all that stuff. Developer experience becomes more important than performance and scalability. So SEs on the field, solution engineers, solution architects, realize that we have a different crowd. It's not about architects anymore. It's not about DBAs anymore. We have so many developers that we're meeting every day in our sales activities that we need to get better at that. This goes up into how sales has been funding this function because, well, they need us. They need to be more developer friendly. So the way it's architected, we're building the team right now. We have 4 different sales regions. We're going to have one DevRel per region, basically, at the start to support SEs. That's our main activity. It's hard to split between supporting marketing and sales, and we're sort of trying to figure out what's the best way. Supporting SEs, building more content, and we'll be measured on that. How our scaling forces are SEs. Right now, we are building the team. We cannot go all out in traditional DevRel activities. We have to scale through the SE team, so we have to make them better at talking to developers. And so that's mostly where it's originated from. It's also originated from, well, we don't have a DA team anymore, so we need to go and rebuild community and DevRel. And that's the marketing part. We need to support the field marketing, so we need to do all the conferences, all the events, all the webinars and stuff like that. So this is where it comes from. Now, in terms of metrics, we're still figuring this out. I'm not going to say I'm against metrics. Metrics can be gamified, and that's sort of that's a problem to me. When you go to a conference and you set up a game, for instance, and you try to get all those leads coming in to be nice with feed marketing and say, look, we have all those leads. You probably have some people that just give you their phone number or email just because they wanted to win that Lego set that you have on your booth. So having too much of a metric approach to me is an issue in the DevRel team. It suits very well with other teams. I think my function right now is to help other people scale, and it's really hard to measure myself or help them scale. So it's just about my input and their feedback on what we do to help them be better. And we can see that, training SDRs, training SEs, we have better feedback and we have better sales situation right now.
So for you, it's very much, it really is about that integral relationship between sales and marketing. But Matty, you were talking about the importance of feeding back into the open source projects that Ivan relies on. And just to set the context, Ivan provides hosted instances of many open source projects for storing and working with data, for example. So do you get involved with the sales and marketing team?
Yeah, and we're kind of building that muscle right now, because this is something. So for context, especially for people listening, I've been at Ivan since August. So what is that now? 8 months, maybe a lifetime, maybe just a few minutes, depends on the horizon that we're looking at. But kind of looking at how we can start to build to that. So how we are involved with sales at this point. So I can tell you what we're starting to do, and then maybe what the next part that we're getting in place. One of the motions, and I will caveat this with, this motion only really works when you've got a pretty well-defined and mature sales engineering organization, because if you aren't careful and you try to do this, your DevRels become sales eng, which is, there's nothing wrong with being a sales engineer, but it's a different role and a different skill and a different approach. Caveat aside, disclaimer aside, what we try to do is figure out how we can have our developer advocates connect with customers and prospects to help them be successful, but not necessarily in a way to pitch the product or give a specific training on the product or do something to that nature. So, for example, we can have a customer that says, hey, we're trying to solve this data governance problem. So actually what we do is we don't wait for the customer to come to us, because at the end of the day, what do SDRs and AEs want to do is they want a reason, an excuse to have a conversation with the customer, right? So one of the reasons can be, hey, you know what, Laurent's going to be in region at this event. We know your office is there. We'd love to have him come in and talk to your team about data governance, right? Not talk about how to use Ivan, not talk about our product and our pitch and our demo, but this idea that's relevant to the decision makers and the practitioners that would be Ivan customers. And this has a couple really effective things. One is, again, in past lives of doing this, how many times I'd walk out of a meeting and the rep would say to me, I've been trying to meet that CTO for 6 months. And now we had an excuse, but it also shows some value to the customer or the prospect, which says, hey, when you have this relationship with us, you have access to these subject matter experts and to these things that are not just us coming in and demoing. And then the point to how that connects with your sales eng is the sales eng is the fast follow, right? To be able to say like, okay, cool. So all these ideas we just talked about, by the way, like this is how you can do that with Ivan if that's of interest to you. You have that connection. And so we're building that muscle here at Ivan and figuring out how we do that, because it's, if you aren't careful, and this is the caveat, right? You have to also make sure you're really crisp with teaching your field how to do this with you, because otherwise, because people just look and they take a guess. They're like, oh, well, I will. This is how I want to use a DA. I want to do this, and we are putting together kind of our catalog to say, hey, these are the things we can do. The other place is getting into kind of the idea of a DQL, a DevRel qualified lead, as Mary Thengvall talks about. We used to call them warm handoffs, and then nobody knew what that meant. So kind of rebranded as DQLs because XQL means a thing. But even then, I think like a DQL doesn't look like an SQL or an MQL or whatever. To me, it's a touch point, but it's not something that goes into a campaign. So what we're building now and working towards this idea that when we have a touch point with someone, and as a DA, and then also with our community, we're going to get that into Salesforce under that and say, hey, okay, I talked to Tina Smith, who's an SRE at JP Morgan Chase. Cool. What never can happen there is a rep goes in and says, oh, Tina's a contact, I'm going to reach out to Tina. No. What you do is when you're looking at that opportunity, you go, hey, Maddie talked to somebody over there. Let me talk to Maddie and find out more about what we understand of that case. And that's a really, you have to be really crisp and protective of how your CRM and how all that stuff is set up, because otherwise it just looks like, because we know, again, there's a whole thing. Developers don't want to be marketed to. That's baloney. Developers don't like to be traditionally marketed to, and shoving them in a drip campaign is a sure way to piss them off, right? So if we're going to capture those as DQLs, we put them in a way where if there's anything that looks like a campaign, it's something that provides value to them, but fundamentally it's just additional context. And then from a self-serving perspective, this is how we start to show influence, right? Because then we can start to say, okay, this deal happened. I mean, were we influential? Who knows? And all this stuff is connecting influence is still guesswork. But to Lauren's point, like, we don't want to sit there, because by doing it this way, I think it helps counter away from that sort of gamified metric. You don't set targets to say we should have X number of DQLs this month. That's just a thing we do as part of our operational thing, but we look at the outcome, and then we want to be able to measure those outcomes, but we have to be really careful that they don't look like goals, because, you talk about funnel. I mean, DevRel floats so high above the funnel, right? Attribution is so hard to do that you kind of have to look at it as an after effect. Just say, hey, was this influential? It's a lot harder to see a direct connection between I did this exact activity and it turned into this exact revenue.
Does that work in the context of, sorry, I'm not super familiar with DQL as a, will you walk it back for me? Sorry.
Yeah. So, okay. So just a little quick history lesson. And I believe in the Business Value of Developer Relations book, they're still referred to as warm handoffs. I think they got rebranded after the book. But so there's the idea of saying in community and DevRel, we have this idea of a warm handoff, which is some connection point of someone we have an interaction with that we hand off to somebody else in the organization, whether it's to product for feedback, maybe it's to marketing for a case study, maybe it's a sales lead, maybe it's recruiting. So problem is then, as an industry of the entire world, nobody knew what the heck the word warm handoff meant, but we know what QL qualified leads are. So we started calling them DQLs, DevRel qualified leads, which again is slippery and messy because they're not necessarily sales leads. So really what these are is they're recording contact points that happened that said I had, but it's not like a booth scan should never be a DQL. And this is actually the problem with, like Laurent said, with the gamifying, because I was at a place where we said, we're going to have X number of DQLs a month. And you know what we would do? We said a booth scan at a community event like DevOps Days, that's a DQL. Well, no, it wasn't helpful because we don't, unless we put the context. So what these end up doing is these are, it's our way of tracking a connection point of a person who's connected maybe to either to an opportunity or an account that we have, so that we have that context, but it's not someone to outreach to, right? It's someone to, again, and I've definitely had that. I mean, think about it as a much more operationalized way of what a rep does when they reach out to the DA and say, hey, I see you're connected to Joe Smith at Panera Bread. Can you tell me about what they're doing there? Because I see you connected in LinkedIn. How about if it's a little bit more, because in that DQL, it'll be what the DQL is. It says, hey, I met Joe Smith from Panera at DevOps Days Pasadena, and we talked about this. So now there's some information, but at no point it's not an outreach contact. It's kind of that internal connection.
So if you go to the traditional SDR flow that we have different stage of qualification, and we know that a warm handoff would be way, at the end of the funnel. All the colleagues that we get from a conference will be stage one, and that warm handoff would be S3 or S4 or deeper.
Yeah, I guess I have seen DevRel teams directly impact. It's not tied to revenue, but certainly like within the concept of product qualified leads, there's definitely certain activities that are identified as potentially lead generate, like moving more towards within the lead funnel, where I have seen teams like pretty directly measured.
I think that's why I really don't like calling them leads, because a lead is lead to the thing. Like, it actually is kind of a diagonal entry point. It can be a diagonal. It can also be the first contact, because we don't know, right? Like it can be like, hey, I talked to Tina at JP Morgan Chase. They're not even an opportunity for us yet. Okay, well then that ends up being created. Or it can be they're an existing account, and this just gives us some more information. So I think that's the problem with it being a QL, is leads imply sort of this very linear flow of a pipeline, right? And that's not really what this is.
Multi-channel attribution has never been done very well, and it is very tough to for one single group to take credit for like a lot of the lead.
Partially just want to see that we
it
touch
goes.
that opportunity, right? Like even that is just
totally.
even sometimes enough. Although you're right, because the way it happens, I remember at PagerDuty, for example, it would be the way that they did sort of the indirect attribution. Like we would get, but then this became a metric with our team was rev. And it was funny because it would be like, I talked to so-and-so at KubeCon once and it turned out to be a $2 million deal. So we got a piece of it. I mean, we didn't get paid, but I mean, it looked like we impacted that revenue. Like, did we? Who knows?
I think we're getting into attribution. We could have a whole session on that, especially as the number of digital channels is just growing exponentially. I want to hear from Tim because what we're getting into is the tension between DevRel and sales and the sacredness of developer experience for developer-centric companies. Now, Tim, leading up sales at Temporal, we're a customer. We've had a great experience onboarding and adopting the technology as well. How do you balance this like intention that you see Maddie, Laurent putting into the experience for the developer into how you actually deliver, say, a sales-led experience in community alongside DevRel at scale?
Yeah, it's always funny how much tension seems to exist, or people want to call it out. And the first thing I would say is like it should be really transparent, and people should be having conversations who lead these teams about what each team's incentivized around and goaled on. And if you can do that from the get-go, then you're going to pretty quickly identify like, hey, there's a lot of friction between our two teams just by the nature of how we're incentivizing each team or what we're measuring them on. So that's the first thing I would point out is like, hey, well, what is this team responsible for? How are they going and metricing it? And then what's the point of that thing? So like at the end of the day, we all work for companies that eventually want to make money. And the DevRel responsibility is developer relations. If we're selling to developers, we want to grow that community. We want to make this an attractive place to be. But I don't think we need to lie to ourselves and pretend that the eventual outcome is to eventually have customers who spend money on the product. And the best way, or the way that, ideally I think every company wants to be built around and monetize their product is by people genuinely wanting to use the product. So they use the product because they get value out of it. So the thing that I think that we've been, and we're lucky enough that we're pretty early in this whole journey where we're not, multi-hundreds or billions of dollars in revenue with all sorts of different fiefdoms, and it's hard to get people aligned. We're small, so we can tackle this challenge pretty early right now. But anyways, my broader point would be is, if we can get alignment around incentives and understand what each team is rowing towards, then it's much easier to create programs and handoffs and to think about what each team is driving for and how their different kind of motions in this funnel actually can work together. So like a small example would be is like meetups. I'm sure most folks have some type of meetup goal or they're regular running meetups. Well, meetups in isolation as a DevRel activity, I would say yields pretty poor results as opposed to if you had a full organization function built up around it. So your marketing team and demand gen teams are going to do quite a bit around the mechanics for actually running these meetups and driving attendance to it. You might want to tap into the local sales community or the local sales team for helping to get a prospect or a customer to actually speak at that event. So, hey, we're working with a customer in XYZ city. We have an event coming up. Reach out to that person, offer them to join the meetup as a speaker. They have an incentive to speak because oftentimes it's like free recruiting, so on and so forth. And so now all of a sudden, DevRel and sales are really working towards the same thing. Hey, we want people at this meetup to grow the community and the project. Well, sales wants to be there to actually work with the different folks who are there from all sorts of different aspects. It's an easy, free touch point for my customer. It's a free win with my customer if they get to speak at the event. Also, I get to talk to people and prospect into it. So you can play this out on and on and on. And then even just think about the post-event process, right? So it's like, okay, well, what's the point of doing that meetup? Well, we all just talked about the reasons and goals and incentives. Okay, so after meetup, how are we all going to integrate our post-meetup touch points to make sure that they make sense? Well, we had a bunch of prospects who through that event raised their hand and said they'd like to talk to sales. Well, we probably shouldn't have those people be followed up by DevRel. We should just have them be followed up by sales. So anyways, I think my broader thing here is that integrating the teams, making sure that people understand what their goals and responsibilities are, and then being basically like transparent around how we're all codependent on each other is super helpful. And I think the thing that largely gets missed is like the main culprit of the friction between the various teams. And so I think it puts a lot of emphasis emphasis on your leadership to identify that and work towards, I don't know, mitigating that or just like addressing that friction if it's out there.
When you think about like scaling your sales team, you're bringing in sales members that maybe are more junior or haven't worked directly with a DevRel org. How do you prepare them? I
think so look, you can say a ton of things mechanically and tactically how you onboard and train people, but the number one thing for me is to make sure that everybody's, and I think this also, I mean, for what it's worth, it is and somewhat embedded in what your go-to-market and business model is, like how do you monetize, price, and package. But at the end of the day, if everybody's aligned around this idea that adding value at any given touch point along somebody's journey is our core shared goal, and actually solves quite a few of the problems. So when you're talking about this idea of like a DevRel, like warm handoff and things of that nature, I think there's a few different ways that we've seen that DevRel warm handoff actually can be initiated by sales. So a small example would be is we're in our community, we're observing our community, we can see somebody consistently asking questions around, I don't know, some type of e-commerce checkout process, back-end challenge they're having. Well, sales maybe identifies it because they're paying attention to the community, looking for opportunities to sell into the community. But when we identify that person, we might say to ourselves, hey, look, they're really pretty early in their journey. They're asking questions that our DevRel team would actually do a really good job around, because they're going to go in and answer a tactical question, but really based off of, like, say they've been in our community for 2 months, it's really pointing out that there's an opportunity here for DevRel to set in and probably expand the art of the possible, or do some like baseline education with that particular customer. So now you have this weird kind of back and forth where maybe a BDR identifies that this person needs some help. We ask the DevRel team to step in, given where they're at in their journey. DevRel team runs that meeting. Post that meeting, DevRel says, hey, look, these folks are not ready for a commercial product in any given, near-term thing, but they've set them down on this pathway to be in a really good spot in, say, 6 months from now. And now the sales organization can, set up flags or reminders or whatever it is to circle back with that, or use tools like a common room to set alerts looking for behavioral characteristics or traits or things that then say, hey, this person's 6-month journey we expected is actually happening in 3 months. And there's some type of signal they're saying that then says raise their hand again. So I think there's like all sorts of different things you can do around the training and onboarding. But if you get everybody rallied around this idea that all of our jobs are to add value, and adding value eventually turns into money, then again, these handoffs become pretty easy. And then, to I think it was Matt's point around this idea of attribution and kind of leads not following the linear path. It's a great example. It's not a linear path. It's like starts with sales, back to DevRel. Then it's going through this funnel of adoption. Oh, we're looking for signals where you can actually short circuit this adoption funnel and dive in. And when you dive in at that point, it might be, hey, we asked DevRel to come back in again, because really what they're asking for now is like, can you do a lunch and learn where you can talk about our technology to a bunch of other teams who are now observing the success of this core team that originally adopted. And you're all over the place. But again, add value, and eventually that value is going to turn into somebody raising their hand and looking for help that you can monetize on. And they're going to be very happy to do that if their experience has been one where when I engage with XYZ company, I always walk away with something net positive. It's not a waste of my time, and it's not just a veiled pitch of their services.
I think stop pitching is a good way to enable sales engineers to be more DevRel friendly. That was a huge part of our sales enablement, developer enablement part. Lead with problem, not pitch.
I was just going to say too, with the onboarding, just kind of a thought. We're not doing it this way here at Ivan because we're in a different stage of this, but I've seen this work too, is that when DevRel can sometimes be really helpful in the onboarding process because they understand the community and their problem. And so again, at PagerDuty, we provided some of the general training, we didn't sit and do it every time, but that content that was then training to the sales team about this is what the DevOps community is like, this is what DevOps people are like, et cetera, et cetera. But what that does is that almost from the beginning sets up this, you have these subject matter experts over here that can coach and can connect and what that goes. And I think, to be frank, I think most of the problem is on the DevRel side and not on the sales side. We need to get over ourselves a little bit. And I think honestly, most DevRels probably agree with what Tim said and probably are in that place. But we have a lot of very loud people in social media who want to play the one true DevRel. We are not sullied by filthy capitalism. We fight for the user. We do all this stuff. And the reality is, we all want to make some money. And as I've said before, there's this sort of belief that when you're leading with sales, you're manipulating people. What are all those things? And I'm like, hey, if the only way that someone would pay for your product is if you trick them, why are you working at that company? Right? That seems like a different problem. But So I think we need to understand. And like I said, I think what I've started to observe is that most chop wood, carry water, DevRel practitioners probably get this just fine. But we do have a big perception that's led by, kind of this idea. And the reality is, yeah, we all want to get the money there. We're just a little more indirect by it, right? I always said before, I said the best salesperson at Chef Software when I was there was Nathan Harvey, the VP of community. Nobody saw Nathan coming, right? Because they're like, you're in, think about Sales Eng, right? Like I've been to sales, like also, by the way, I think that Sales Eng to DevRel pipeline is underrated and can be very powerful. But I used to say when I was a sales engineer, I'm like, customer will tell me stuff they would never tell an AE. Because you're like the engineer guy. I'm like, I'm still trying to sell this to you, and then that goes 100-fold for a DA, right? They're like, oh, you're the community person, you're a hug ops person. I'll tell you anything, right? So like, and this is not tricking people, by the way. Like I know this all sounds like but it's not. It's just a way of being able to have conversations in alternate ways. Tim, I really like that back and forth handoff you were talking about. I've myself fallen victim of sort of thinking in this one directional way in this particular implementation. So that totally awesome reminder.
Yeah, I think the other thing too is like, especially for these bottoms up developer kind of like PLG adoption type led motions, you think about you mentioned JP Morgan. Selling into JP Morgan is it's a series of sales cycles that last a decade with tens of thousands of developers. And so you land inside one part of the organization. Well, that's like a huge opportunity and signal for DevRel to say, actually, we probably should be allocating some type of resources to this mega firm who could potentially be a massive adopter of this technology. And now that we have a foothold, it's like, okay, well, DevRel actually can do quite a bit of work to help expand or evangelize the technology inside of that organization. It seems like a thing that everybody would be excited about. And when I think about it, it's like, oftentimes we're preparing content. It's like, well, how can we contextualize this content to the people we're talking to? Like contextualize them in like industry specific or use cases or whatever it is, the things that get them excited. Well, there's nothing more powerful, in my opinion, than being able to go into a customer, taking existing use cases and using that as one of the ways that you evangelize and talk about the technology and the problems it solved and the from to this like broader audience. But this broader audience always, has this core characteristic, which is, hey, we're all working at the same company. So again, that's like a non-linear path, right? It's like, we touched them at the front end, then there was a deal, then we landed it, now they're running in production. Okay, now we're going to go back to that organization because there's this huge community that we haven't touched yet.
Matthew, remember this sort of came up a little bit in some of the conversation after my talk at DevRelCon, which is this is one type of DevRel we're talking about. So there's a lot of people that believe DevRel is about advocating for the developer into product. And all of this is deaf ears on that, I think, because they're like, this isn't what DevRel should be doing. So I'd be curious, and I don't know that we're equipped, although Laurent, a little bit sitting in product, how do you, when you're more of a product oriented advocate, where do those connections come as opposed to an awareness and an enablement oriented developer advocate, which is kind of a different kind? And some people are all of them, but we've been focusing more, I think, on that latter one.
One thing for sure is that someone's paying for your salary, and the goal of a company is to make money anyway. So whatever you do, that you're in the end here for the sales motion, even if it's for the greater good or however you want to call it. But I'm tired of having people asking for a 6-figure salary and not wanting to understand that the whole of the company is to actually sell stuff to people, which I know sounds like a big shortcut, but that's what we do. Wherever you are, that's what company does.
I think there are specific programs within product that benefit from that sales orientation. Like when you're thinking about defining your persona or your ideal customer profile, by being engaged directly with community or individuals at events and identifying use cases and so forth, it actually can accelerate your go-to-market strategy because you're kind of the tip of the spear in terms of seeing what developers are naturally doing with your product or articulating the problem statement better or anything like that. Those are pretty natural. Additionally, if you are more product oriented, then one of the challenges, especially in larger companies, so if you're a developer advocate or DevRel with a large organization, then building customer advisory boards is actually pretty challenging because getting the right persona from the right type of company in a room with other like-minded individuals at the right time with your product teams is actually really hard to do. Usually it's recruited based on like how much does this company spend and who do we know in the company. And so you end up with this hodgepodge of people representing different viewpoints that may or may not actually help accelerate your iteration and innovation process. And so I think all of those can be really helpful. Additionally, one thing that go-to-market relies on is case studies. And so when you launch a new product, you always want a couple logos and stories of adoption going out with it. But typically the go-to-market side and product marketing isn't necessarily equipped, and they keep going back to the same well to find these individuals. Whereas developer advocates talk to someone new nearly every day.
I've seen at the very, very early end of it for as far as like DevRel and their interaction with the companies is that even prior to like knowing what your commercial product is going to be, if you are doing something that is like category creation, the DevRel team has to do so much work in actually giving an identity to the persona in which you're trying to pursue. So like think about having to build an entirely new set of best practices like the Jamstack folks, right? I think the folks at Netlify started working on Jamstack probably many years before their true commercial product was released. And part of that is that by figuring out this group of practitioners who have obviously been like forgotten as far as tooling is concerned, you can figure out their identity, figure out their motivations, talk to them and figure out all their problem set and actually build into the solution that you need to with a very like sharp set of features. I don't know how much patience people will currently have in this environment around that type of thing, but I think frankly, if you are a company that has created an entire category and an ecosystem which other players can jump into, like that is the most amazing win of all. And I think even for community as well, just to, and for DevRel folks to look at it and be like, we have created a movement in which people are doing things in a more sane and better way. Like that is ultimately like, what a dream to market that, what a dream to sell that, you know?
Was that a little bit like when my career ladder at one place said to get to the principal level, it was create something industry defining like blameless postmortems, and I was like, really? That's my promotion cases. I have to. I was
You're like, yeah, that's like one person's gonna just do that. That's
right. Yeah. But if you can, as an organization,
there's a common problem that marketing and DevRel teams face, which is that outsized achievements like that set the bar, and then everyone else has to kind of remind people that actually, you know, there's a bit of luck involved as well as foresight and talent and all of that. But a lot of DevRel is a process that is just kind of ongoing, and after some time of hard grind, you see the results, and they might not be outsized, they might just be appropriately sized.
My firm is all ex-operators from dev tool and infrastructure companies, right? And so I can only really speak from my own experience with an early stage firm and a firm that specifically invests in early stage companies, and say that the things that we look for are indications that developers are excited, or there is some ability to build community, right? Like it is very hard to graft community onto a sales-led organization after the fact. The culture is pretty different, and there are these kind of like very mercenary, very rigid, funnel focused activities, and there isn't a lot of room to do a little bit more discovery. And I think what usually ends up happening is we more often see companies that are still figuring out what the product is, and we'll bring in DevRel type people to, help them discover that, help them figure out understand their persona, help them understand if the problem that they are trying to solve for or the solution can be validated. In the late stage, it becomes a lot more revenue focused.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say, and I wonder also if we're seeing this a little bit in downturn. We've had a lot of pretty blatant examples, also some indirect ones of there's these things where we look at this organization that is driving the state of the art forward, right? I think about PagerDuty. We did this with Ops Guides with like PagerDuty's incident response framework that has nothing to do with the product, but it is the gold standard of how to do incident response. And everybody knows that. And so we built a lot of stuff around that. You look at you talked about Netlify with the Jamstack stuff, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. But and we're trying to do this with Ivan. We've got some stuff coming that's like, hey, it's content that's not direct to that, but it's to show it's authority building. It's how do we drive the state of the art forward? But then we look at stuff like DigitalOcean, which has happened to all their docs team, right? They had that. So, and it was like, okay, we cut that. Actually, it was funny. The reason I bring up Netlify, and someone proved me wrong, but we were looking for some examples for some content we were doing. And I was like, oh yeah, we're like, Netlify has all this great, you can't find it anymore. There was all this, strike me down for using this word, but all this thought leadership content around this stuff. And it disappears. And I think that's a late stage thing that happens too, is you start to sit there and, like you said, you bring in CROs and stuff who sit down and say, wait, why are we spending money on something that's not directly impacting funnel, that's not doing that? And it gets hard because I think that's a very indirect kind of marketing and leading, but it's incredibly powerful. And so when we're in a case like now, in a downturn, like, what did I say, right? It's like right now, we're kind of, to survive, have to do things that require less imagination to show value. And it's a bummer because that's what separates you apart, because besides being just like turnkey and, transactional. And yes, we have this great product, but it's all the ideas behind it. And that stuff starts to, it's a great way early stage to grab on and get a name. And then I feel like we've got companies that did that. And then, like you said, then they get later stage and it's like, oh, but that doesn't matter anymore. Because it costs a lot of money for something that doesn't look like it brings any revenue, right?
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's less that it's late stage and more that it's like, if you raised a huge round, like if your valuation is primarily on paper and is not validated by the actual revenue behind the scenes, right now you are scared, right? And I think right now, in particular, like, this is a perfect storm because tensions, like we talk about DevRel and sales and marketing getting along, like tensions are high. User and customer churn is pretty high due to company closures and budget cuts. Teams haven't met they've been remote working for years now, and you have no idea if you even know you've met your salespeople or marketing people or whatever in person. And then like companies who have raised too much money or need to extend their runway because they don't want to fundraise in the next year or so, or they don't want to, or they can't IPO in the next year or so, have to do riffs and layoffs. And so departments are kind of like blaming each other as far as missed targets are concerned. And this is where, I mean, marketing teams and DevRel teams get gutted at times like this. And so I think it is very timely for us to talk about like how to tie your metrics to something very solid. But I think there is also, the really big opportunities don't come from churning the crank and just like trying to double, triple your revenue every single year. At a certain point, you hit, at a certain point, that's just like, there needs to be a more creative approach to all of this. And you can't continue to be like a market leader if you don't change.
I mean, that kind of brings us on to something I wanted to talk about, which was friction between sales and marketing. We've talked about harmonizing them and good relations, handoffs, and so on. But it's not always the case that these teams get along. And I think one reason is there is some friction between marketing and DevRel because sometimes it feels like they're going after the same bits of budget and the same results and so on. I'd love to hear how you've dealt with that friction in your organizations?
Some of this is perceived and some of it isn't, right? Like perception is based in reality. There definitely are, people who work in sales that are not, necessarily what come across as the most ethical, maybe, or whatever. There's also people like that in DevRel, just so we're clear, right? But I do have a story like that about it's a reframing exercise a lot, number one, right? And this goes back to, this is part of the reason why, and as Tim talked about, it's about understanding the incentives. And there's a lot of people in DevRel that don't know what sales motion looks like, right? And the more that you understand, again, I've said this before, I'm like, we're supposed to be, what do people call developer advocates? Empathy engineers. We have zero empathy for the salespeople in our company as a unit, generally speaking. But if we understand where they come from and what it's like to work in that role, so sometimes it just helps by just doing the job together, because then the people become people. And then sometimes they become people and you're like, I don't actually like you. And that's a thing that happens too in life, right? So it is a little bit that reframing, a little bit of that understanding. Here's one of the biggest ways to put it in context. I remember my team used to be invited to our sales kickoff at one of the companies because it was a good way to talk to them. But so we were sitting in all those, and of course they're having the big dinner, and it's like, hey, this is everybody who won the trip to, this exotic location or whatever. And I remember our CEO said, we have all these other people in the company that say, well, this isn't fair. Why do the sales reps get to go to Greece and get to do all this? And she said, do you want your job to be continually reevaluated every 3 months about whether or not you were even reasonable at what you do and live or die every day? Cool. Then you can go on an exotic trip, and that's the thing to understand. Like, there's a thing, we don't get it as much in non-sales roles, that like you could have the biggest quarter the company's ever seen. You could sign the biggest deal that was ever done. And on the last day of the quarter, everyone applauds you. The next day, your sales VP goes, what do you got for me now? But don't care. Don't care. What's now? What's in your pipeline? Where's it going? And when we understand that, we understand the people's motivations and what they're trying to accomplish. And we also, just one of the things for us to learn is like, don't bother salespeople at the end of the quarter. Like, that's not the time to ask for a favor from an SA, right? Or that's a beautiful thing for us is we don't, even when you're connected to sales as a DA, you're not closing any deals, right? We don't have the panicky end of quarter. We're earlier. So I think that's one of the things, is just working on stuff together eventually breeds empathy, right? Just by doing it. And it's like, we talked about, I said a lot of times we just haven't even met people in person and worked on stuff. So I do think this sort of ride along to customer stuff helps a ton, because now we're people, right? We're not just Slack messages. We're not just requests. We're also humans.
I think it depends on what you're selling, because if upsell for you is super important, as DevRel, doing lunch and learn, doing lots of activities at an existing customer is bringing a tremendous value to the rep. Actually, you're really helping them, making sure that they can upsell more. So it's not just before; it's also after. Now about the sales, I guess it depends also on where you are, because a sell on a 0 to 10 million will be completely different than a rep from 10 to 100 or 100 to 200, because ARR becomes more important than just getting logos. So it completely changes the way sales works as well. And I know, because I've been at Couchbase in 2014, where we were on the 0 to 10 phase or 0 to 100, and now I'm in the higher phase, and it drastically changes the way they operate. And if ARR becomes more important, and if churn becomes much more important metric as well, then there has a very big impact in how we keep and how we grow our existing customer base.
We've had a really interesting conversation. I think, though, to start to wrap things up a little bit, do you have any closing bits of advice from all your experience, each of you, on what DevRel people, perhaps at the start of their career, should be looking out for when trying to make the most of those relationships across the organization? Get to know them, just talk to them. That's what Maddie said. Yeah, like, make them also a human being, not just a function. And yeah, get to know what other people do in the company. Like, some tech will stay in their tech bubble for years and never understand what marketing does, or what sales does, or what the go-to-market motion is. And that's, if you're a DevRel, that's a problem. You should understand all the other, not all, but most of the other roles, especially in the go-to-market motion. And you're a transverse role. Your DevRel is a practice.
It doesn't have to stop with people hired as DevRel. It could be anyone. And I know a huge part of my role is to actually talk to sales and make them more DevRel-ish in a sense. And I think that's what you should do. You should talk to other people.
I think especially if you're starting out, so the advice is different for a DevRel leader because I'm going to pin some of this on your DevRel leader. But if you're starting out, make sure that you have a crisp understanding with your leadership about where those boundaries are, and because on the other side of this, DevRels are the people we're going to say, like Laura just said, hey, be open, do whatever. It is really, really hard for people in this role to say no to people because you fundamentally don't want to do this job unless you're someone that wants to help people. And that is so, and you will if you don't have a kind of not necessarily programmatic, but specific way that these engagements happen, you're going to end up just sort of doing whatever you're asked of. And so it's easier to say yes, actually, the more senior and authoritative you are in the organization. So being able to say no, being able to escalate, but ask questions, right? And again, remember, yes is, no is temporary, yes is forever. It's true in open source maintaining, and it's true in this thing too. Because once you say you're going to do a thing, now you're doing the thing, and you're probably going to have to do it a lot. But no can be, let's find out a little bit more about it. So I would let your boss be the bad guy.
And Dana, for the early stage developer tool companies that you're working with, is there a playbook that you have that you think would be kind of generally applicable to other firms, or is that really specific to HeavyBit? Or what advice do you give to those companies when they first start to look at how to engage with developers, which I guess is at the very beginning for your portfolio?
Yeah. I think generally, early stage companies pursue DevRel programs because there's some developer-led product in the broader commercial effort. That being said, if you really just hope to outsource that to some poor DevRel that you hire versus actually caring about the community, it isn't going to work. It is so much bloody work to listen that closely to your users, especially when you actually get to a point where, you hit where you get into the thousands and hundreds of thousands. So I would say if you're going to do community, be all in. And if not, then figure out what your go-to market is going to be. But I don't think it's for everyone. I think it is extremely efficient from a marketing and commercial effort perspective, but I don't think that it is meant to be for every team or product, frankly. There's a lot of deep tech products that, are for enterprises or for large enterprises. Tracing, for example, isn't necessarily something that, IC devs will care about, right? So you sort of have to figure out your flavor of it.
And Josh, what are you folks at Common Room seeing that you would point to as like the I guess best practice in terms of this integration between all the different touch points along the customer journey, I guess the buyer journey?
Yeah, I think it's understanding that a lot of the things that would come natural to DevRel, whether it's a workshop, a lunch and learn, an event, they can directly support sales. And so don't think that just because you're doing something that isn't necessarily funded or asked for by sales doesn't mean it can't be associated with their outcomes. And so having an open mind in terms of what you naturally would do in terms of creating awareness, driving adoption, etc., plays a role. And then creating an input metric around that. So if we want to do workshops or this or that, hold yourself accountable to that and then see what happens. The lagging indicators that you might see in terms of adoption by people that attended those, they will show up. I think DevRel is this belief that if we do the right things for developers to become aware, adopt our products, engage, if they feel heard, if we can accelerate their journey so that they can deliver real outcomes for their companies, then it will be a net positive for us too. And so realizing that most of what you're doing will connect to sales in some way. Now let's just try and be thoughtful around what we prioritize and then hold ourselves accountable to do it. And then you'll get a lot of support.
Well, one thing I would say is that as a DevRel person, you probably need to be quite vocal about what you've done as well, especially if you've done a favor to another team, and look at ways of repurposing that so it goes more directly towards your own goals. So if you do a lunch and learn, how can you turn that into a Twitch stream or some other reproducible, reusable bit of content? Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, for taking part in this discussion. I'd like to invite each of you to share where people can find you on the internet. So, Matty, let's go first with you. Where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Matt Stratton or on Mastodon at Matt Stratton at Hackaderm. And I'm also on LinkedIn at Matt Stratton. You find me pretty much Matt Stratton everywhere would be the places at mattstratton.com.
Great, thanks. And Dana, where can people find out more about you and HeavyBit?
Yeah, so you can check out heavybit.com. You can honestly email me directly at dana@heavybit.com, which is very easy. I am Dana Oshiro on LinkedIn, Twitter, basically everything.
Great, thanks. And Tim, how about you?
Yeah, best place to find me is just tim@temporal.io or on LinkedIn. You can just find Timothy Hughes at Temporal.
And Laurent?
You can find me with L Doguin, which spells LDOGUIN, on anything social. And if I'm not there, then that means I don't have an account there. Twitter is probably the best way to get to me.
Great, thanks. Well, Josh, it's been great spending this time with you. I'll leave the final word to you then. Where can people find more about you?
So you can find me on Twitter, pseudotechy, LinkedIn, of course, Josh Gross, and then JG at commonroom.io.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, take a look at developerrelations.com, and I'll say thank you very much and goodbye.